From high above the blue curve of Earth, they watched us like anthropologists studying a curious, unevolved specimen. The Valari Ascendancy, rulers of 100 star systems, speakers of logic, wielders of light-based computation and gravity-warping ships, had finally turned their gaze toward the outlier. They called Earth a primitive anomaly. A world of contradiction. Savage yet self-aware, fractured yet stubbornly alive. To them, we were a joke told across the stars. Their decision was not to conquer, at first. That was reserved for threats, for competitors, for a species capable of holding a blade at the Ascendancy's throat. We weren't seen as any of that. We were seen as an opportunity. A case study. A classroom. Something to refine, correct, and reshape. Their leadership classified the campaign as a civilizational uplift. A sterile phrase that meant, overwrite what exists and replace it with what is superior. Theirs. The Valari's emissary's ship didn't arrive in silence. It arrived in spectacle. Light flares danced across Earth's orbit as their vessel unfolded itself from dimensions humans had never seen. It shone brighter than the moon, humming not with violence, but with arrogance. They transmitted their first message in every major human language, an invitation to evolve, to embrace wisdom, to shed ignorance. Their words dripped with condescension disguised as benevolence. They spoke of their compassion in offering assistance, of their pride in guiding the lost children of Earth. Their first error was assuming humans would be grateful. At first, Earth said nothing. Nations scrambled behind closed doors, intelligence agencies screamed warnings, military leaders debated action, and people stared up at the glowing anomaly in the night sky and wondered if it was a trick, a test, a god. But no official response came. The Valari took this silence as consent. In their culture, refusal came with ritual. Protest came with ceremony. Humans offered neither. And so, the Valari interpreted Earth's hesitation as submission. Another mistake. They began the uplift process by deploying satellite arrays in orbit, blanketing Earth's electromagnetic field with their own systems, offering free access to clean energy, vast knowledge archives, and neural enhancement modules. They dropped monolithic stations into oceans and deserts, disguised as gifts. Everywhere they went, they offered a hand and demanded thanks. Their first transmission to the population of Earth, once the arrays were complete, was a global message, a broadcast that spanned every screen, every device, every frequency. It showed scenes of alien cities, perfect order, post-violence societies. It declared humanity outdated, broken, lost. The voice, even after translation, held a lilt of amusement. "You are behind," it said. Asterisk. "But we are patient." Asterisk. But humans are not like other species the Valari had encountered. There is no single voice, no universal creed. What one group worships, another burns. What one calls sacred, another calls a weapon. In their attempt to understand Earth's civilization, the Valari saw only chaos. What they missed was the pattern inside that chaos. The thread. The stubbornness. The monoliths did not go untouched. In some places, people gathered around them in awe. But in others, they were defaced within hours. Painted, sabotaged, wrapped in wires and drowned in fire. A Valari observation drone was brought down by a slingshot and a sharpened chunk of metal. Another was swallowed by an abandoned warehouse, never to be seen again. Across human networks, a single message began to ripple, not from a government, not from a general, but from 100 anonymous voices echoing the same phrase, asterisk. "We are not yours to fix." Asterisk. And then the gift stopped being accepted. The Valari Council, watching from their sterile chambers high above, laughed. They called it a natural reaction of inferior minds to overwhelming truth. They predicted resistance would last months, perhaps weeks. That humans, in their simplicity, would come to understand the value of obedience once shown the futility of opposition. Their analysts built models. Their language systems refined persuasion protocols. Their emissary repeated the global message, this time with softer tones and more calculated emotion. Earth still said nothing. No welcome. No declaration. No unified war. But they began turning off the power the Valari had given. One by one, human systems went dark, not from sabotage, but from choice. The Valari laughed again. And in that laughter, they failed to notice the sound beneath the silence. The breath before a scream. The pause before the strike. Because Earth was not preparing to protest. Earth was preparing to answer. They believed gifts would bind us. That energy without cost, knowledge without struggle, and convenience without control would render us docile. They deployed them carefully, glittering towers of power, floating hubs offering bio-upgrades, embedded assistants that spoke in soft tones and promised a better world. These gifts were never labeled as tools of dominion, but even the simplest minds on Earth knew that nothing came without price. Especially not from above. Some took them. Of course they did. Who wouldn't be tempted by instant medicine, by soil that grew crops in poisoned land, by sight restored in the blind and age turned backward by machines older than empires? But acceptance was never universal. There were too many scars. Too many stories. Too many generations raised on the memory that when something powerful comes bearing gifts, it often comes bearing chains. In villages, slums, and war-torn zones, the towers were sometimes revered, lit with candles, marked with offerings. But elsewhere, they were destroyed. Not with missiles, but with intent. Hammered, cracked, ripped apart piece by hands that had built fire before they built language. The Valari watched the destruction with irritation, not fear. They had seen protests before. It faded. It always faded. Civilizations crumbled more easily when the people thought resistance was obsolete. But Earth did not crumble. In the great cities, the lights that once glowed with alien power began to flicker and vanish. Their power sources disconnected, not by accident, but by design. Earth's engineers, disorganized in centuries behind the Valari in raw capacity, tore apart alien panels with screwdrivers, water cannons, and heat. Not to replicate. To understand. And once they understood, they turned the technology off. Not out of fear, but out of principle. The Valari struggled to comprehend. Their psychology models failed to explain humanity's reaction. Civilizations were supposed to evolve when shown superior methods. They were supposed to assimilate. But humans were shedding the gifts like a bad skin. Even those who used them began to hide them. Entire villages disappeared from scanner view, going silent. Urban districts refused upgrades. The Valari called it regression. But the humans were not moving backward. They were preparing. Resistance was not shouted. There were no uprisings in the open streets. No armies declaring rebellion. What emerged instead was a kind of silence, an organized stillness that unnerved their watchers. The Valari deployed more drones, expanded their surveillance. They assumed Earth's lack of coordinated resistance was a sign of confusion. Then, the missing began. Drones failed to return from jungle scans. Data links to towers in isolated regions dropped without interference. One aerial monitor, sent to investigate a mining valley in what had once been a major industrial zone, transmitted its final feed, scorched marks in perfect formation, rising smoke, and a crude banner made from welded metal. The banner bore a message, not in Valari code, but human script, asterisk. We learn by breaking things. Asterisk. A ship sent to investigate that region was swallowed whole by the mountains. Its hull was later found in pieces on 3 different continents. No wreckage was identical. No crew survived. One of the hull fragments had a single word burned into it, asterisk. Declined? Asterisk. The Valari didn't respond with retaliation. Not yet. They were still amused. Frustrated, perhaps, but amused. To them, humans were children throwing rocks at stars. The council laughed at the thought that these defiant primitives believed they could resist inevitability. The ambassador program was expanded, this time with more persuasive language, more emotional cues, more holographic empathy. But Earth answered not with a voice, but with a decision. One night, without warning, a central transmission tower, gifted to one of the largest cities, exploded from within. The blast pattern wasn't clean. It wasn't surgical. It was brutal. Sloppy even. But it was deliberate. No alien signature. Just human grit. Human wires. Human fire. No one claimed responsibility. No face appeared to explain why. Because there was no need. The act spoke louder than any declaration. You could not dress conquest in silver and expect Earth to swallow it. And still, no human leader came forward. No faction demanded terms. The world simply withdrew. One city at a time. One signal tower at a time. Like a tide pulling back before a storm. The Valari looked down upon Earth, still calling it backward. They did not yet realize. It had simply chosen not to crawl. They had assumed resistance would come in waves, predictable, emotional, and short-lived. What came instead was silence broken by precision. The Valari scouts began to vanish in patterns too irregular for terrain to explain. Small patrols would descend into river valleys, mountains, or ruins, only to fall off the network within minutes. No flares. No gunfire. No data. Their absence was total. At first, the Valari thought it was environmental, a miscalculation of Earth's geography or electromagnetic disturbances. But then it happened in open fields, on dry roads, in plain daylight. A unit deployed to investigate a dense forest region reported contact with what it assumed were local civilians. They were wrong. The last footage recovered from their chest recorders showed humans in ragged clothing, faces covered, moving with purpose. No shouts, no panic, just motion. And then the feed ended. What returned to the Valari was one of their own scout walkers, walking upright, fully functional, until it collapsed outside the nearest base. Its interior had been hollowed out. Not just sabotaged, *reverse star. Every system had been mapped by hand, drawn in chalk on its hull, as if left behind as a lesson. At the center, a human phrase, *. We're watching you too. *. The Valari called it escalation. Earth never labeled it. They didn't need to. What unnerved the Valari wasn't the casualties. It was the intent. The humans weren't reacting. They were anticipating. They knew the rhythms of patrols. They lured squads away from coverage zones, split them from their groups. Traps weren't always explosive. Sometimes, they were environmental. Misleading signs, collapsing bridges, vehicles buried in mud then rigged to trigger when approached. Every defeat looked like it had been studied, rehearsed, and designed to send a message. Back in orbit, Valari data specialists tried to reconstruct the resistance network, to identify leaders, to trace a single signal that might give away a command structure. But there was none. The resistance was not led. It moved like weather, independent, scattered, and yet, always arriving where it hurt the most. The conclusion was terrifying to them. Earth wasn't being led. It was aligned. No one had told these humans how to fight. They had simply chosen to. The Valari, in all their centuries of conquest, had never fought an enemy who operated from principle, not orders. Most species could be broken by hierarchy, cut off the head, and the body would thrash, then fall. But here, there was no head. Only hands. They deployed psychological warfare, broadcasting calming signals, flooding human frequencies with artificial music, synthetic voices mimicking trusted faces. But humans weren't listening. They had shut off their networks. Their old systems were gone. In their place, handwritten notes. Walkie-talkies. Whistles. Light signals. Runners. Analog ghosts. More units began disappearing in zones previously marked stable. The Valari's combat simulations lost predictive capacity. Earth's behavior shifted daily. No pattern lasted long enough to adapt to. Terrain became weaponized. Weather was used against them. In one valley, a Valari dropship was brought down using wind currents guided by hand-built fires and pressure differentials. No alien could have seen it coming. Earth had studied not only the invaders, but the land itself. There was no mercy. No captives. But also no torture. No spectacle. The humans weren't fighting for revenge or sport. They fought because surrender had never been an option. It wasn't personal. It was necessary. The Valari began issuing new orders. Patrols no longer traveled in groups smaller than 10. Air cover became mandatory. Every city installation required double the security drones. Yet the losses continued. Now, even the air wasn't safe. Some drones returned carrying footage of symbols burned into the rooftops. Old Earth symbols. Warnings. Not to the aliens, but to each other. It was as if the entire population was talking in a language the Valari didn't know existed. One alien commander, in a decrypted note later scrubbed from the archives, wrote, **. It feels as if they'd been preparing for us their entire lives. **. But Earth hadn't been preparing for them. Earth had been preparing for anyone. And that was the difference. The Valari had come to teach. Then to tame. Then to contain. Now, they realized, they were being hunted. The Valari believed fear was a one-way mirror. That only the weaker side could feel it, and only the stronger could weaponize it. But now, for the first time, they saw their own tactics mirrored back at them, distorted, brutal, and coldly effective. Earth didn't just resist anymore. It reflected. And it had learned fast. The humans had no warships in orbit, no superweapons to match alien design, no AI capable of calculating probability across solar scales. But what they had was understanding, * of their enemy star. The technology that had once towered above them was no longer alien. It had been taken apart in basements, in abandoned bunkers, in silence. It had been reshaped, bent, and corrupted, not to copy, but to invert. Valari drones began going offline mid-flight, not due to sabotage, but confusion. Their pattern recognition systems were overwhelmed by non-digital signals, flashes of color, high-frequency noise, optical illusions drawn into city streets. Human fighters carried jammers built from scavenged components, tuned not to block communication but to overload decision logic. A perfect machine, if made to doubt itself, collapses faster than any soldier. Even the Valari's neural interface weapons, designed to predict and counter behavior, became liabilities. They had been programmed with models of standard combat, efficiency, tactics, strategy. But Earth had abandoned standard a long time ago. Their behavior was erratic by design. Their actions did not follow logic. They fought like a language with no translation. In one key region, a Valari base deployed suppression signals to block all frequencies, desperate to blind the resistance. Hours later, the entire base collapsed in coordinated attacks from beneath. Humans had used no communication. Only timing. Only agreement. It was as if they shared a clock in their bones. The Valari's command algorithms flagged a new threat class, cognitive incompatibility. A species that could not be modeled or anticipated. One whose thinking bent in ways foreign to structured AI. In short, they were fighting ghosts who thought like fire. Uncontrolled, unknowable, untouchable. And then, Earth turned to fear itself. They began to speak in the Valari's language, but only when captured. The words were distorted, delivered in unnatural cadences. A Valari scout who survived such an encounter returned uninjured but shaking, repeating the phrase, *. We are your mistake, walking. * When pressed, he said the human had no mouth visible. No weapon. Only eyes. And silence that broke something inside him. Propaganda towers, once used by Valari to broadcast messages of peace and order, were hijacked. The screen showed human children smiling, then glitching into war footage, then into static that mimicked Valari emergency alerts. The tone was subtle. But the message was clear: we hear you now, and we are not impressed. In other regions, captured drones were sent back with slight modifications, optics switched, identification tags reversed, command signals bouncing on feedback loops. The machines went wild, attacking their own outposts. An entire Valari depot self-destructed after its internal systems misread friendly units as human incursions. All because someone on Earth had figured out how to mimic trust, then break it. But the most terrifying shift for the Valari wasn't tactical. It was emotional. They started to hesitate. Their soldiers double-checked shadows. Drones fired preemptively. Patrols began to fail missions due to delays, pauses, and fear-triggered retreats. It was no longer just battle. It was doubt. They had once seen humans as scattered, uncivilized, incapable of unified resistance. But now, they saw order hidden in the cracks. Not through hierarchy, but through conviction. The humans were not killing to win. They were killing to refuse, and that refusal echoed deeper than any victory. One intercepted message sent between Valari commanders in secret broke protocol. They are not primitive. They are raw. And we mistook that for weakness. It was no longer a fight for dominance. It had become a war of meaning. And Earth had more of it than the Valari could understand. In the end, it wasn't a final battle that turned the tide. No great explosion, no triumphant declaration, no shining flag raised above the fallen. The end came quietly, the way an idea dies, without sound, but with permanence. The Valari stopped advancing. Then they stopped engaging. And finally, they stopped speaking. Their ships, once gleaming symbols of power and superiority, began to rise from Earth's orbit one by one, burning fuel not for dominance, but for escape. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't apologize. They didn't even look back. They simply left. The last Valari drone abandoned its post over a coastline still smoldering with the heat of war. Its optics, fractured by months of resistance, caught a final image before blackout, a ruined human structure, rebuilt not with alien tech, but with rough stone, wood, and bare hands. No banners. No warnings. Only people standing, watching the skies, not to celebrate, but to remember. That was how Earth ended the war, with endurance, not victory. The Dominion that had once scorned humans for their backwardness now recorded them in red ink, under a new classification. Not primitive. Not hostile. But something worse, unmanageable. The report was filed, then sealed. The Valari, despite their pride, knew the truth. They hadn't been defeated in combat. They had been denied. They came with gifts and were met with refusal. They came with persuasion and were met with silence. They came with war and were met with will. Across their systems, discussions about Earth ceased. Not by order, but by instinct. The name itself became a quiet mark in navigational logs, coordinates to be skipped, avoided, left to its own gravity. In their training halls, their commanders no longer mocked the campaign. It was spoken of the way one speaks of fire that burns without smoke, of animals that stare back with eyes too human. No Valari ship would visit Earth again. Not in this cycle. Not in the next. And Earth? Earth did not pursue. The people did not reach for the stars in vengeance. They did not launch new campaigns. They did not build monuments to themselves. They simply rebuilt, slowly, with grit. Power was restored by hand. Fields were retilled. Ruins were cleared one brick at a time. In the ashes of war, Earth remembered what it had always known, that survival was not a prize but a process. That peace was not given, but earned every day through the refusal to surrender what made them human. There were no parades. No shining heroes. No single leader to stand before cameras and claim credit. The war had never belonged to any one person. It had belonged to all of them. Every corner of the planet had chosen the same thing, independently, without agreement, without instruction. A single principle had tied them together more tightly than any government ever had. We will not be shaped by hands that do not bleed like ours. The aliens had come to mold Earth into something it was not. To teach it how to be better. But Earth had already learned something far more important, the strength to say no. And somewhere, far across the stars, in rooms filled with algorithms and sterilized glass, other species began to take notice. Not all would become enemies. Not all would try what the Valari had. But all would remember the one truth that echoed in the space between worlds. Earth was not a cradle. It was a crucible. It did not nurture softness. It forged resilience. In its storms, in its wars, in its ruins and rebirths, It created a species that had stared into the face of something greater, and laughed back with blood on its teeth. They had called humans primitive. Because they built with stone, and fought with fire, and died with stubborn hands wrapped around the neck of the impossible. Because they loved without condition, believed without proof, and resisted without logic. But that was the power they never understood. It wasn't Earth's strength that had beaten them. It was its principle. No matter how far behind humans were, how clumsy their machines, how fractured their pasts, they had held to one immutable truth. We do not kneel. And because of that, the most advanced empire in the known galaxy had been forced to flee, not from weapons, but from meaning. So the world turned. Quietly. Slowly. Healing. Watching the stars. And waiting. Not in fear. But in memory.